On May 29, 2036, the U.S. Navy opened a new chapter in its push toward unmanned war at sea. In a single announcement, it named 7 companies to compete in at-sea demonstrations for a medium unmanned surface vessel, or MUSV, turning a long-running research effort into a live industrial contest. The field is striking for its range. Sea Machines, Leidos, Saronic Technologies, Galliano Marine Services, Pacmar Technologies, Birdon, and Huntington Ingalls Industries were all selected, each now pulled into the same accelerating race. The terms are blunt enough to reveal the Navy's priorities. A successful entry can receive a $15 million incentive, along with eligibility for follow-on production. That is not a ceremonial prize. It is a signal that the service wants designs that can move beyond experiment and into something scalable. The clock is equally revealing. Testing begins next month, and it is expected to be complete by October 2026. That is a compressed window for a vessel category tied to autonomy, endurance, and trust in machines operating at sea. This did not begin from nothing. Earlier prototypes, Sea Hunter and Seahawk, had already given the Navy a working glimpse of what unmanned surface vessels could become. They served as autonomous research and experimentation platforms, and they were used to support maritime domain awareness and anti-submarine warfare. They also integrated with fleet exercises, which matters. These were not just floating lab concepts kept away from real naval operations. They were early signs that unmanned vessels could be inserted into the Navy's wider tactical picture. Now the atmosphere is different. The question is no longer whether the Navy can put autonomous boats in the water at all. The question is, which builders can deliver a design the service will trust, repeat, and potentially buy in larger numbers. That shift changes the tone from research to selection, from prototype curiosity to market pressure. It also sharpens the central tension. The Navy is not simply shopping for advanced machines. It is testing how much performance it can get, how fast it can get it, and what level of risk it is willing to accept along the way. Behind this new marketplace is a harder strategic demand, one that reaches beyond any single boat or company. The service appears to be searching for something cheaper, more numerous, and faster to field than the traditional path has allowed. What the Navy appears to want now is not simply another impressive platform to admire at a pier or display in a budget hearing. It is trying to solve a far more practical problem. A force can possess some of the most capable warships ever built and still find itself stretched thin across too much ocean, too many missions, and too many possible flashpoints. The pressure behind the current push for unmanned vessels comes from that gap between exquisite capability and daily presence. The service is looking for ways to put more sensors in more places, for longer periods, at lower cost and with less operational strain than a fleet built around a limited number of large crewed ships can sustain. That logic is visible in the Navy's own shipbuilding plan. In May 2026, the service described a larger, more balanced fleet built around a high-low mix, combining advanced combatants with cost-effective frigates and unmanned systems. That phrase matters because it signals a departure from the idea that every serious naval problem must be answered by a small number of premium ships. The high end still matters. The Navy is not walking away from major surface combatants, submarines, or carriers, but the plan suggests that relying on the high end alone creates a force that is too expensive to expand quickly, too slow to refresh, and too numerically limited to cover the demands of modern maritime competition. A high-low mix is an admission that sophistication without sufficient volume leaves dangerous gaps. Those gaps are especially stark in the Indo-Pacific. Geography there imposes its own discipline. Distances are enormous. Sea lanes are long. Choke points matter, but so do the wide, empty spaces between them. Commanders do not just need to arrive in a crisis. They need to watch, track, communicate, and remain present before the crisis fully declares itself. A small fleet of complex crewed ships can move rapidly from point to point, but it cannot be everywhere at once. Every deployment becomes a choice. Every patrol in one area means absence in another. Every maintenance delay, crew rotation, or contested logistics problem is magnified by the sheer scale of the theater. That is why mass, in this discussion, is not mainly about prestige. It is not about creating a larger-looking fleet for ceremonial effect. And it is not even only about counting hulls. The real value of mass is what it does to an operational picture. More vessels can carry more sensors. More sensors can stay on station longer. Longer presence can sharpen detection, extend awareness, and make it harder for an adversary to move without being seen. Numbers also complicate the enemy's planning cycle. A dispersed force can scout, relay, feint, absorb attention, and create uncertainty. Mass expands combat options because it gives commanders more pieces to position, more routes to threaten, and more ways to impose dilemmas without always placing sailors in the first line of exposure. That begins to explain why lower-cost unmanned craft have become so attractive. Reporting around the Navy's current small boat effort has emphasized that the search is not just for a single exquisite unmanned hull. The interest is broader than that. The Navy appears to be looking for procurement speed and lower-cost unmanned mass, something that can be fielded in larger numbers and adapted more quickly than traditional shipbuilding programs usually allow. This is consistent with the wider language in the shipbuilding plan, which stresses speed to capability. Iterative development, stable requirements, modular open systems, and industrial expansion backed by private capital. In other words, the service seems to be looking for a way to acquire useful maritime capacity on a faster clock. That faster clock matters because traditional naval acquisition can take years to produce a ship, and even longer to mature a concept into a stable program of record. For a force confronting rapid changes in sensors, autonomy, networking, and electronic warfare, that pace can become its own strategic liability. If every answer requires a long design cycle, a custom architecture, and a fully refined requirement before the first useful unit appears, then quantity comes late and adaptation comes even later. The Navy's recent language suggests impatience with that pattern. It points toward a force that can add capability in increments, test it in the fleet, and revise it without waiting for a perfect end state. Unmanned systems fit that logic because they can, at least in theory, move more quickly from experiment to deployment. There is also a harder question beneath the industrial one. How much risk a Navy is willing to distribute across a force rather than concentrate in a few irreplaceable assets. Large crewed warships carry enormous value, both military and political. They are expensive to build, expensive to maintain, and impossible to replace quickly. They also carry people, which means every deployment decision is inseparable from human exposure. That reality naturally pushes leaders toward caution. Unmanned vessels do not erase risk, but they change its character. A lower-cost vessel without a crew can be pushed farther forward, held on station in more uncertain conditions, or used in more ambiguous roles than a major crewed platform might be. A Navy seeking options short of immediate escalation has reason to care about that distinction. This is where leadership framing becomes important. Defense reporting on future fleet discussions has described senior Navy thinking in terms that reject a one-size-fits-all design and instead emphasize hedge capacity, risk-worthy mass, and robotic autonomous systems. Those ideas should be understood carefully. They are not a promise that any particular unmanned program has solved the operational problem. They are better read as a strategic frame for what leaders believe the future force requires. Hedge capacity means keeping additional options available rather than depending on a narrow set of highly specialized platforms. Risk-worthy mass suggests having enough lower-cost capability that commanders can accept the loss or exposure of some systems without crippling the overall fight. It is a different way of thinking about presence and attrition, less tied to preserving every asset at all costs. That analytical frame helps explain why mass is inseparable from persistence. A ship that can surge into an area briefly is useful, but a vessel that can remain present, report continuously, and be replaced by another similar vessel without major strain offers a different kind of advantage. Persistence shapes the battle space before any engagement begins. It allows patterns to emerge. It catches anomalies. It supports targeting, warning, and command decisions. Official Navy messaging around the surface unmanned community reflects this emphasis. The mission of Surface Development Squadron and the work around medium unmanned vessels have been described in terms of introducing and deploying systems, sensors, networks, and payloads that support fleet commanders and enhance lethality. That language is less about a standalone robot ship and more about extending the fleet's sensing and networking reach. This is also why deception matters so much. A force made up only of a few celebrated platforms is easier to understand, track, and prioritize. A force that includes many smaller unmanned vessels introduces ambiguity. Which craft are carrying useful sensors? Which are decoys? Which are relays? Which are tied into a larger kill chain? Which are simply present to force surveillance effort and consume decision time? Naval warfare has always involved uncertainty, but distributed unmanned systems can increase it at scale. Even if each individual vessel is modest, the collective effect can be disproportionate. The point is not that every hull must be deadly on its own. The point is that a networked mass of lower-cost systems can shape the enemy's picture and protect more valuable assets by making the environment harder to read. In the Indo-Pacific, that kind of distributed ambiguity has obvious appeal. The challenge there is not only fighting at range, it is maintaining awareness and optionality across a theater too large for a small fleet to saturate with crude presence alone. A handful of high-end warships can deliver formidable power, but they cannot maintain dense coverage across every line of approach, every island chain, every passage, and every likely zone of friction. They must be tasked selectively. They must refuel, rearm, and rotate. Their commanders must decide when concentration matters more than dispersion. Lower-cost unmanned systems offer a way to thicken the maritime picture without requiring the Navy to generate a full crewed deployment for every surveillance or signaling task. That does not mean the Navy is replacing crewed combatants with robot flotillas. The official planning language argues for balance, not substitution. The high-low mix only works if the high end remains credible and the low end remains numerous and useful enough to matter. In that sense, unmanned mass is less a revolution than a correction. It responds to the realization that a fleet optimized around exquisite ships can become brittle if it lacks enough affordable elements to screen, sense, scout, relay, and absorb pressure. A balanced fleet can let premium ships do the jobs that only they can do, while cheaper systems shoulder more of the daily burden of presence and information gathering. That is a different allocation of naval labor, and it may be the real significance of the current turn. Reporting on the wider unmanned push has suggested just how ambitious some of the discussion has become. Defense reporting has said that thousands of smaller unmanned surface vessels and more than 30 medium unmanned surface vessels by 2030 have been discussed as part of the Navy's broader direction. Those figures should be treated as reported discussion rather than settled official outcome, but they help illustrate the scale of thinking involved. The conversation is not about sprinkling a few experimental craft around the edges of the fleet. It is about whether the Navy can generate enough lower-cost maritime mass to change how commanders think about coverage, exposure, and tempo across an immense theater. If that vision holds, then the strategic value of numbers becomes clearer. Thousands of smaller vessels would not matter because they look impressive on a chart. They would matter because they could carry sensors, extend networks, and remain forward in places where keeping a major crewed ship continuously present is difficult or inefficient. They could widen the fleet's perimeter of awareness. They could create false leads, compel responses, and give commanders more ways to probe an area without immediately committing premier assets. They could also provide a cushion against failure. If some systems break, drift offline, are intercepted, or prove unsuitable, the force does not go blind. That is the appeal of mass when it is framed not as prestige, but as resilience. There is an industrial argument embedded in all of this as well. A strategy built around a small number of large and exquisitely engineered ships depends on lengthy production timelines and a shipbuilding base that has little margin for sudden expansion. The May 2026 plan's emphasis on revitalizing the industrial base and using modular open systems points to a desire for more adaptable production. Lower-cost unmanned vessels can support that if they are built with more flexible architectures, and if the Navy can avoid turning them into miniature versions of the same slow, requirement-heavy procurement model it is trying to escape. The attraction is not just cheaper hulls, it is the possibility of faster iteration, broader supplier participation, and a pathway for private capital-backed growth that can deliver usable capacity sooner. Still, the pursuit of cheap mass carries its own tension. The Navy wants vessels inexpensive enough to buy in meaningful numbers, but capable enough to contribute real military value. Too cheap, and they become little more than targets or experiments. Too ambitious, and they become exquisite again, merely crewless versions of the complexity and expense that already constrain the fleet. That tension may be one reason so much official and reported language circles back to modularity, iterative development, and stable requirements. The service appears to understand that if it overburdens these systems with every possible demand, it will price away the very mass it says it wants. Cheap mass only works if it remains genuinely buyable at scale. That is why the current Navy interest should be read as a response to strategic arithmetic, not technological fashion. The arithmetic begins with distance, with too much water and too many tasks for a small number of premier ships. It continues with persistence, with the need to sense and remain present over time rather than merely appear in moments of crisis. It widens into deception and combat options because a distributed force can complicate an adversary's decisions and give commanders more choices below the threshold of immediate high-risk commitment. And it ends with risk distribution, the recognition that a future fleet may need enough lower-cost, risk-worthy systems to operate forward without placing every consequential decision on the shoulders of a few exquisite crewed warships. Seen that way, the Navy's turn toward unmanned mass is less mysterious than it first appears. It is the logical answer of a maritime service trying to reconcile vast geography, finite budgets, industrial bottlenecks, and the demands of modern sensing and networking. The aim is not to replace prestige ships with disposable gadgets. It is to build a fleet that can see more, stay longer, deceive better, and act with greater flexibility than a thin force of expensive crewed vessels can manage on its own. The argument for cheap mass is really an argument about operational endurance and strategic choice. And once that argument is accepted, the next question follows almost automatically. What kind of unmanned ship can actually deliver those advantages? And what exactly is the Navy trying to buy when it talks about a medium unmanned surface vessel? What the Navy means by a medium unmanned surface vessel is not just a ship with no crew on board. In practical terms, it means a vessel large enough to stay at sea for meaningful periods, carry useful systems, connect into fleet networks, and do work that matters beyond a laboratory test. The phrase sounds technical and abstract, but the concept is much more concrete than that. A medium unmanned surface vessel is supposed to be a working part of naval operations, not a novelty. It has to move through real water, operate with other ships and aircraft, feed information back into larger formations, and support commanders who are trying to understand and shape what is happening across wide stretches of ocean. The easiest way to understand that idea is to begin with the two names that appear again and again in official material: Sea Hunter and Seahawk. These vessels are the baseline because they are the Navy's visible prototype examples of the category. Officially, they are autonomous prototype medium, unmanned surface vessels used for research and experimentation. That wording matters. It establishes that these ships are not simply conceptual drawings or future promises. They exist, they have been operated, and they have been used to explore what this class of vessel can do. At the same time, that same wording also makes clear that they are not the finished answer. They are tools for learning what the answer might need to be. That distinction between prototype and operationally useful platform is central to the entire MUSV story. A prototype proves that important pieces of the idea can work. It can show that an autonomous vessel can navigate, that it can remain at sea, that it can carry mission systems, and that it can interact with fleet units in controlled or semi-controlled settings. But that is not the same as fielding a platform that commanders can rely on routinely, across different theaters, under pressure, and at scale. A research vessel can help validate concepts. An operational platform has to survive schedules, maintenance cycles, communications problems, rough seas, shifting tasking, and the simple fact that warships are judged by whether they provide dependable value to the force, not by whether they looked promising during a demonstration. Sea Hunter and Seahawk matter because they gave the Navy something real to experiment with in exactly that gap between theory and practice. Official descriptions present them as distributed sensor platforms that support maritime domain awareness and anti-submarine warfare. Those phrases can sound bureaucratic until they are translated into what a fleet actually needs. Maritime domain awareness means knowing what is out there, what is moving, what does not belong, and what may become a threat long before a manned ship is forced into close contact. Anti-submarine support means helping detect, track, and maintain awareness of underwater threats that are difficult, expensive, and dangerous to counter. In both roles, the vessel is valuable less because of dramatic action at a single moment and more because it extends the fleet's eyes and ears over time and distance. That endurance of presence is a major part of what makes the medium unmanned concept attractive. A ship like this can be sent forward to watch water that would otherwise require scarce manned assets to cover. It can help maintain a wider sensing picture across a dispersed maritime environment. It can support the fleet not by replacing destroyers, submarines, or aircraft, but by allowing those more expensive and heavily tasked assets to be used more selectively. The vessel becomes a forward node in a larger system. Its importance lies in persistence, placement, and connectivity. If it can remain on station, contribute sensing, and stay linked into the force, then it starts to create real operational options for commanders. This is why official descriptions emphasize distributed sensing instead of presenting these vessels primarily as independent strike platforms. The logic of the prototype baseline is that Sea Hunter and Seahawk help spread sensing capability across the battle space. A distributed sensor platform is not valuable because it is powerful in isolation. It is valuable because it extends the fleet's reach in a way that is harder to target, harder to blind all at once, and potentially cheaper to sustain over broad areas. Instead of concentrating every important sensor and decision point inside a small number of manned hulls, the Navy can push some of that sensing outward. That changes the geometry of maritime operations. It creates more observation points, more paths for information, and more ways to build awareness before a crisis becomes a close-range fight. In anti-submarine support, that logic becomes even more important. Submarines exploit distance, concealment, and uncertainty. Any platform that contributes to tracking, cueing, or extending the duration of surveillance adds value to the larger anti-submarine effort. Official material does not present the prototype vessels as standalone submarine hunters that solve the whole problem by themselves. The role is more supportive than that, and that nuance matters. These vessels contribute to a networked hunt. They help widen the search, maintain contact chains, and support a fleet architecture in which information is collected across multiple platforms and fused into something commanders can act on. In that sense, the vessel's autonomy is important, but its real significance comes from how it fits into a broader system of sensing and fleet support. That broader system appears clearly in the mission language surrounding the Navy's unmanned surface vessel squadron. Official fleet reporting describes the mission as leading the introduction and deployment of medium unmanned surface vessels, along with the critical sensors, networks, and payloads needed to support fleet commanders and enhance lethality. The phrasing is revealing. The ship alone is not the capability. The capability is the ship plus the systems it carries, the networks it plugs into, and the operational structure that makes its data and presence useful to the fleet. In other words, MUSV does not really mean a bare hull with autonomy software. It means a naval node that has to be integrated into command relationships, communications pathways, sensing architectures, and mission packages. That is the practical definition that matters most. A medium unmanned surface vessel is a fleet support platform built around autonomy, but made operationally relevant by sensors, payloads, and network connection. If those elements are missing or immature, the vessel remains a test article. If they are dependable and integrated, the vessel begins to matter as a real instrument of naval power. The difference is not semantic. It is the difference between a ship that can complete an engineering trial and a ship that can be assigned to a commander with confidence that it will contribute to the mission. For the Navy, that is the line between experimentation and utility. This is also where reported requirement details become important, though they have to be handled carefully. reporting his described prototype-oriented requirements that include roughly 2,500 nautical miles of range, a speed of 25 knots, operation in sea state 4, payload capacity up to 25 metric tons, space for at least two 40-foot containers, and an operational availability goal around fiscal year 2027. Those details are useful because they make the idea of a medium unmanned vessel more tangible. They suggest a ship that is not tiny, not disposable in the simplest sense, and not limited to a single fixed internal role. But these figures should be understood as reported requirement details rather than final formal Navy doctrine. They are best read as indicators of the kind of platform being explored, not as a definitive last word on what every future MUSV must become. Even so, the reported containerized payload element is especially revealing. If a vessel is expected to accommodate containerized systems, that implies flexibility is built into the concept from the start. The Navy may be looking at a platform that can be outfitted for different missions through modular payloads rather than one locked permanently into a single narrow task. That does not tell us every payload the Navy will ultimately field, and it does not authorize assumptions about formal weapon fits or final doctrine. But it does illuminate the design logic. A medium unmanned ship becomes more attractive if it can be adapted, reconfigured, and inserted into different support roles as fleet needs change. In practical operational terms, that points toward a vessel that is part truck, part sensor node, part network scout, and part enabling platform for missions that do not always justify exposing a larger manned warship. The emphasis on networks is just as important as the emphasis on payload space. A vessel at sea that gathers information but cannot pass it reliably into fleet decision-making is of limited value. The same is true of a vessel that can receive tasking only in narrow circumstances or cannot remain integrated with other units during exercises and operations. Official source notes indicate that the prototype vessels have integrated with fleet exercises, and that matters because it shows the Navy is not treating them as isolated engineering curiosities. Integration with exercises is one of the clearest signs that the service is trying to learn how these vessels function inside real naval formations. Can they support manned ships without becoming a burden? Can they operate in ways that improve awareness instead of complicating command? Can their data, autonomy, and mission systems work in the rhythm of fleet activity? Those are the questions that turn a prototype into a candidate for regular use. That fleet support role is easy to understate because it lacks the drama of traditional warship imagery, but in modern naval operations, support can be decisive. A platform that expands maritime domain awareness, contributes to anti-submarine support, and carries mission systems where commanders need them, can shape the battlefield long before any visible clash. It can help a fleet commander allocate scarce assets more intelligently. It can maintain watch in areas where persistent manned coverage would be expensive or impractical. It can provide distributed sensing across a wider front, creating a deeper and more resilient picture of the maritime environment. In that sense, a medium unmanned surface vessel is less about replacing a destroyer and more about making the destroyer fleet more effective. This is why the phrase medium unmanned surface vessel should not be read as a mere size category. Medium refers not only to scale, but to a balance of endurance, payload, and operational usefulness. The vessel has to be large enough to carry meaningful systems and survive real sea conditions, yet still positioned as something different from a major manned combatant. It occupies a middle ground in naval architecture and in naval strategy, too small, and it becomes little more than a short-range demonstrator with limited mission relevance. Too ambitious, and it risks inheriting the cost, complexity, and expectations of a traditional warship. The attraction of MUSV lies in finding a practical middle, enough ship to matter, enough autonomy to persist, and enough modularity to evolve. Seen from that angle, Sea Hunter and Seahawk are not interesting because they answer every question. They are interesting because they anchor the category in something real while revealing how much remains unresolved. Officially, they show that autonomous prototype vessels can support maritime domain awareness, contribute to anti-submarine warfare support, and integrate with fleet exercises. That is already significant, but the operational challenge is larger. The Navy needs platforms that can do those things consistently, with usable payloads, dependable networks, and support structures that commanders trust. A vessel that can sail autonomously is not automatically a useful fleet asset. It becomes useful when the fleet knows what role it plays, what information it brings, how it is sustained, and how it supports the broader fight. That is why the official mission language from the Pacific Fleet side stresses the introduction and deployment not just of the vessels themselves, but of the sensors, networks, and payloads tied to them. Those words amount to a quiet admission that the ship is only the visible portion of the capability. The harder work is integration. Sensors have to be chosen and matured. Networks have to be resilient enough to support operations. Payloads have to be useful, supportable, and relevant to commanders' needs. Tactics have to be learned. Fleet units have to know how to use the vessel, how to task it, and how to exploit what it provides. Without that, the ship remains an experiment. With it, the ship begins to function as a practical instrument of distributed naval operations. In the end, what MUSV actually means is something narrower and more concrete than the buzzword suggests. It means a medium-sized unmanned ship that the Navy is trying to turn into a useful operational node for sensing, awareness, and fleet support. Its prototype baseline is Sea Hunter and Seahawk. Its proven early value lies in distributed sensing, maritime domain awareness, and anti-submarine support. Its future value depends on whether networks, sensors, payloads, and command integration can turn those prototype lessons into dependable fleet capability. And the reported details about speed, range, sea state, payload weight, and container capacity suggest the shape of that ambition without yet settling the final doctrine. That leaves the program at an unusually revealing stage. The Navy has already shown the outline of the role. It has vessels in the water, a squadron focused on bringing them into the force, and official language that frames them as support assets, tied to sensing and fleet command. Reporting has added texture about the type of platform industry may be asked to provide, including modular payload space and practical performance thresholds, but those reported details still sit short of final certainty. The result is a category that is no longer theoretical, yet not fully fixed. The Navy knows the broad function it wants for medium unmanned surface vessels. What remains unsettled is how to translate that function into an operational fleet of ships that are reliable, adaptable, and available in meaningful numbers. And that is the point where the story stops being only about technology. Once medium unmanned surface vessels are understood as networked fleet support platforms rather than simple autonomous hulls, the industrial question comes into focus. The issue is not just who can build a vessel that floats and navigates. It is who can help produce a workable system around sensors, payloads, integration, endurance, and deployment at scale. Defining what MUSV means in practical terms leads directly to a second question just as important as the first. If this is the kind of ship the Navy wants, why did it decide to spread the competition across so many companies at once? The Navy's answer was not to pick one winner at the start and spend years refining a single preferred hull behind closed doors. It chose 7 companies at once and set them on the same clock. Sea Machines, Leidos, Saronic Technologies, Galliano Marine Services, Pacmar Technologies, Burdon, and Huntington Ingalls Industries were all selected for at-sea demonstrations under the medium unmanned surface vessel effort. That list matters because it shows the service is not treating this as a narrow beauty contest between a few familiar primes. It is treating it as a search across a broader industrial field, with different approaches forced into the water on a compressed schedule. After defining the kind of unmanned vessel the Navy says it wants, the next issue is not simply design, it is market structure. The service is asking whether speed, competition, and repeated testing can produce a useful boat faster than the older pattern ever could. That is the core difference in the marketplace approach. A slow single design path usually tries to reduce risk by choosing a favorite concept early, then moving that concept through long rounds of requirements, redesign, review, and integration. The promise is control, the cost is time, and often a system that arrives after assumptions around it have already shifted. A marketplace model moves differently. Instead of assuming one design office can answer every question in advance, It creates a field of contenders and lets performance, manufacturability, and practical integration reveal themselves under pressure. It is less about perfecting one theoretical vessel on paper and more about seeing which teams can actually turn a broad naval demand into something that can operate, carry payloads, and survive the realities of testing and production. That choice reflects more than contracting style. It reflects a deeper concern inside the unmanned push itself. Reporting around the program has pointed to a Navy that is looking for lower-cost unmanned mass and for greater speed in procurement, not just another exquisite unmanned hull. That distinction is crucial. A single highly specialized craft may be impressive, but it does not automatically solve the larger operational problem if it is too slow to field, too costly to build in numbers, or too delicate to fit into a fleet that needs presence across wide ocean spaces. By opening the lane to 7 companies instead of locking onto one premium concept from the beginning, the Navy is signaling that this program is also a test of industrial agility. It wants to know who can move, who can build, and who can adapt fast enough for a mission area that is no longer patient. The 7 names on the slate also tell their own story, even without assigning them capabilities the public record does not support. Sea Machines, Leidos, Saronic Technologies, Galliano Marine Services, Pacmar Technologies, Burdon, and Huntington Ingalls Industries do not represent one neat category of supplier. The value of the slate is not that each company has been publicly described in detail, but that the Navy has deliberately widened the aperture. It has drawn from a spread of firms rather than narrowing the competition to a single familiar template. In practical terms, that creates a market trial rather than a one-path development program. The Navy is not asking one selected builder to spend years arguing that its answer is good enough. It is asking several builders to prove, in a short and unforgiving window, that their answer can stand up in the real world. The incentive structure makes that demand unmistakable. Successful entries receive $15 million and become eligible for follow-on production. That number is not framed like a token participation prize. It is large enough to matter, but structured in a way that ties reward to demonstrated progress rather than mere inclusion on a planning slide. The money is not the whole story. The more important prize is access to whatever comes next. Eligibility for follow-on production means these demonstrations are not isolated experiments put on the shelf afterward. They are gateways. A company that performs well is not just winning a test event. It is buying a place in the next conversation, where prototypes stop being examples and start becoming candidates for actual fleet presence. That creates a very different competitive psychology from the traditional path. In a slower single design process, the decisive battles often happen in requirements meetings, briefings, and incremental reviews long before the system faces serious operational scrutiny. In this structure, the pressure is harder and more immediate. The companies know that at-sea demonstrations begin next month and should be complete by October 2026. The calendar strips away much of the comfort that usually comes with a long defense timeline. There is little room for leisurely iteration, little room for a concept that only works if future engineering closes the gap, and little room for a prototype that looks convincing in renderings but falls apart when asked to operate under real conditions. Compressed time does not guarantee good results, but it exposes weak assumptions quickly. That timeline also suggests what the Navy is really trying to learn. It is not merely collecting 7 presentations in hull form. It is forcing a concentrated comparison among systems that must show practical utility in water, not abstraction on paper. Reporting on the broader prototype requirements has described an expected operating picture that is demanding enough to separate slogans from working designs. Roughly 2,500 nautical miles of range, speed around 25 knots, operation in Sea State 4, capacity for payloads up to 25 metric tons, and room for at least 2 40-foot containers. Those details come through reporting rather than a final formal public specification. But taken together, they describe a vessel that must do far more than drift around as a technology demonstrator. It must be credible as an operational tool. Seen in that light, the marketplace method is not just about inviting more vendors. It is about testing whether broad demand can be translated into repeatable naval utility under schedule pressure. A vessel that can move at useful speed, carry meaningful payload volume, and stay relevant in difficult sea conditions is already a demanding engineering problem. Doing it inside a structure that expects rapid demonstration pushes the question further. Which teams can make those trade-offs without years of protected gestation? Which can present something that is not merely clever but buildable? Which can show a path from one-off craft to something the fleet could actually absorb? The Navy appears to be betting that those answers will emerge more honestly from parallel competition than from a single extended design story managed from the top down. The October 2026 completion target sharpens every one of those questions. A long schedule can hide uncertainty because time itself becomes a substitute for proof. Problems can be deferred into later phases, integration can be treated as a future issue, and production realities can remain abstract. A short demonstration season does the opposite. It pulls the unresolved parts of the concept into the foreground. If a design can only work after extended reconfiguration, if a payload concept depends on assumptions that cannot be validated soon, or if the vessel's performance envelope is more fragile than advertised, the calendar will expose that. This is why the deadline matters as much as the company list. The Navy is not just comparing boats. It is comparing who can turn an idea into tested hardware before the clock runs out. The $15 million success incentive amplifies that pressure in a useful way. It tells industry that the Navy is willing to reward performance, but only after the sea has had its say. It also creates a discipline inside the competition itself. Teams are pushed to prioritize what can be demonstrated, what can be integrated, and what can plausibly transition into something more than a one-off prototype. That matters because unmanned programs can easily drift toward technical theater, where the spectacle of autonomy overwhelms the slower, harsher questions of endurance, payload handling, supportability, and fleet fit. A success payment tied to this demonstration window does not eliminate that danger, but it helps redirect attention toward tangible proof. It gives the contest a financial edge while keeping the larger reward attached to future relevance. The possibility of follow-on production is where the Navy's broader wager becomes visible. Official language says successful entries gain eligibility for that next step, not that any one company is guaranteed a production contract today. That careful distinction matters. Eligibility means the demonstrations are part of a narrowing process, not the final procurement act itself. But it also means the Navy is trying to keep the door open for rapid transition if a contender proves persuasive enough. Reporting is also described an operational availability goal in fiscal year 2027. That should be read carefully as a reported goal rather than a fixed public promise. Even so, the fact that such a goal is being discussed at all explains why the service has chosen this accelerated marketplace route. A fleet that wants usable unmanned vessels in that timeframe cannot afford a leisurely first chapter. This is where the competitive slate becomes more than a list of contractors. It becomes a mechanism for compressing uncertainty. Rather than placing one concept at the center and hoping it matures on schedule, the Navy is spreading risk across 7 efforts and then using a common demonstration window to identify what deserves to move forward. Some of those efforts may prove more mature, some more adaptable, some more convincing in how they balance endurance, speed, payload, and practical deployment. The point is not that all 7 will survive intact. The point is that the Navy will learn faster by observing several live answers to the same problem than by waiting for one chosen answer to evolve in relative isolation. In a mission area where timelines matter, learning speed is part of combat value. That logic also fits the larger search for unmanned mass. A fleet does not create presence at sea through exquisite scarcity. It creates presence through numbers, persistence, and systems that can be fielded in enough quantity to matter. Reporting around this effort has described a Navy seeking lower-cost unmanned mass, not just technological elegance. The marketplace model lines up with that ambition because it shifts attention from singular perfection to scalable usefulness. A vessel that meets reported operational demands and can plausibly move toward production is strategically more important than a concept that dazzles but cannot multiply. This does not mean low standards, it means a different standard, one closer to wartime logic than peacetime ceremony. The question is not who can imagine the most advanced unmanned boat. It is who can help produce enough credible capability fast enough to change what the fleet can actually do. There is also a quieter message in the decision to run these demonstrations at sea rather than let the competition remain mostly conceptual. Water has a way of exposing the difference between a promising platform and a useful one. A vessel may look efficient on paper and still struggle once endurance, handling, payload arrangement, and maritime conditions begin interacting at once. By setting the trial in motion now, with testing beginning next month and expected to wrap by October 2026, the Navy is compressing not just procurement time but ambiguity itself. It wants evidence gathered under motion, weather, and operational strain. In that sense, the marketplace is not simply a buying mechanism, it is a filter. It separates firms that can participate in the conversation from firms that can carry the burden of turning concept into fleet option. For all of that urgency, caution is still necessary in how the outcome is described. The public facts support a 7-company demonstration slate, a $15 million reward for successful entries, eligibility for follow-on production, a test window starting next month and running through October 2026, and reporting that points to an operational availability goal in fiscal year 2027. They do not support sweeping claims about which company is ahead, which design will dominate, or what final contract decisions have already been made. The significance of this phase lies elsewhere. It lies in the Navy's willingness to treat speed, competition, and practical demonstration as part of the requirement itself. The service appears to be saying that in unmanned surface warfare, the procurement model is no longer separate from the weapon system. How you buy becomes part of what you can field, and that may be the deepest implication of all. By choosing 7 companies instead of 1, and by forcing the competition into a short demonstration cycle, the Navy is turning the MUSV effort into a test of industrial tempo as much as marine engineering, Sea Machines, Leidos, Saronic Technologies, Galliano Marine Services, Pacmar Technologies, Burdon, and Huntington Ingalls Industries now sit inside the same countdown, pushed by the same incentive, and judged against the same broad demand for credible unmanned capability. The marketplace model exists because the old path is too slow for what the Navy believes it needs, but speed alone is not enough. These boats still have to prove they can do real work in real conditions. Once that question takes over, the competition stops being about who was selected and becomes about something harder, what these vessels must actually accomplish when they are no longer prototypes, but part of operations at sea. That is the hard turn in the story. Once a medium unmanned surface vessel stops being a concept on a slide and starts being judged as a working naval tool, the argument changes completely. The central question is no longer whether an unmanned boat is fast, modern, or impressive in a controlled event. The question becomes whether it can keep showing up, day after day, carrying useful equipment, staying connected, surviving rough enough water to matter, and doing enough real work to justify its place in the force. That is the standard every operational fleet eventually imposes, and it is a much harsher standard than a demonstration. In official Navy descriptions, the program's experimental lineage is clear enough. The prototype medium unmanned vessels, Sea Hunter and Seahawk, are described as autonomous research and experimentation craft, used as distributed sensor platforms in support of maritime domain awareness and anti-submarine warfare, and they have integrated with fleet exercises. That matters because it shows the Navy has already pushed these boats beyond pure laboratory work, but it also shows the stage they are still in. Research craft can prove that important pieces of the idea are possible. Fleet assets have to prove that the whole burden of routine naval use can be carried over time without constant special handling, constant troubleshooting, or constant forgiveness from the sailors around them. That burden begins with endurance. Reporting around the program described a target of roughly 2,500 nautical miles. On paper, that sounds like a simple benchmark, a number to compare against other numbers. At sea, it is much more than that. A vessel with that kind of reach is being asked to stay relevant across long stretches of ocean, remain on task without immediate support, and contribute to operations that unfold far from sheltered ports. Endurance is not just a fuel figure, It is a promise about how often the boat will need attention, how far commanders can trust it to range, and whether it can keep working when distances turn every recovery or repair into a serious event. Speed carries the same hidden burden. Reporting also pointed to about 25 knots as a requirement. That is enough to sound tactically useful, enough to imply a vessel that can reposition, keep station, or move where needed with some urgency. But the operational meaning of speed is more demanding than a top-line figure. A boat does not become useful simply because it can hit a number in favorable conditions. The real test is whether it can carry its payload, protect its systems, and still make practical speed often enough to fit into fleet patterns. If commanders cannot rely on its transit time, if weather or system limits strip away that margin too easily, then the boat may look fast in reporting and still feel slow in warfighting terms. Sea state is where the romance drops away. Reported requirements included operation in Sea State 4, which immediately tells you the Navy is not asking for a harbor craft or a fair weather demonstrator. A boat that is meant to matter has to remain usable when the water is unsettled, when sensors are being shaken, when communications become less forgiving, and when mechanical wear accelerates. Sea state is not just about survival. A vessel can survive rougher water and still become operationally marginal if it cannot keep its sensors effective, maintain reliable control, or preserve enough stability to do useful work. The distinction is crucial. Enduring the sea is not the same as delivering value in it. Payload requirements show the same divide between a concept and a fleet instrument. Reporting described capacity up to 25 metric tons and room for at least 2 40-foot containers. Those details matter because they suggest a vessel intended to be more than a single-purpose scout. A boat built around that kind of payload logic is being asked to carry different mission packages, different sensors, different supporting equipment, perhaps different forms of networking or support gear depending on the task. That flexibility is attractive, but it also creates an operational tax. The more a vessel is sold as adaptable, the more the Navy has to prove that the process of adapting it is practical, repeatable, and fast enough to matter. This is why payload swaps become a central concern for operators. In theory, containerized mission equipment sounds efficient. It suggests a vessel that can be reconfigured, reassigned, and turned around without the long delays of traditional shipyard work. In practice, the question is what that swap really costs in cranes, pier time, technicians, checks, software integration, calibration, and test runs before the vessel can be trusted again. A payload that fits physically is not automatically a payload that is ready operationally. The hardware has to connect to the vessel's power and data environment. The network has to recognize it. The crew overseeing the mission has to believe it will work when the boat is sent out beyond easy reach. That is one reason communications matter so much. For any unmanned vessel, the argument over autonomy can become distracting because it tempts people to talk in vague levels and abstract futures. The harder operational question is simpler. Can the vessel remain connected well enough, often enough, and with enough resilience to be useful under real conditions? Not perfect conditions, not laboratory conditions, and not a scripted demonstration path. A medium unmanned surface vessel carrying meaningful sensors or payloads has to exchange information with the rest of the force in ways commanders can rely on. If communications are fragile, delayed, degraded by weather or range, or vulnerable to routine disruption, the entire concept begins to narrow. That communications burden reaches beyond steering and navigation. It affects sensor reporting, mission updates, health monitoring, and the confidence to keep the vessel on station instead of bringing it home early. A distributed sensor platform only contributes if its data can move through the force in time, in usable form, and with enough dependability that commanders plan around it instead of merely hoping for it. Official descriptions of the experimental vessels emphasize maritime domain awareness and anti-submarine warfare support. Those are missions where partial usefulness is not enough. A sensor that works only intermittently, or a vessel that must be handled gingerly because links are uncertain, creates caution where the Navy wants routine. Maintenance may be even more decisive because it is the slow, unglamorous force that kills many promising ideas. Sailors and operators care about maintenance, because they know that the true measure of a platform is not the first week it performs, but the 10th time it has to be turned around after hard use. Unmanned does not mean untouched. Engines still wear. Holes still take punishment. Electronics still corrode. Connectors still fail. And software issues still turn into real operational delays. A boat that saves manpower in one area can easily create a different maintenance burden somewhere else, especially if its systems are novel, tightly integrated, or dependent on specialized parts and specialized expertise. That is where trust begins to form or collapse. Trust in a naval platform is not a slogan. It is a working judgment formed by watchstanders, maintainers, planners, and commanders who decide whether a vessel is worth building a day's operation around. They care whether the boat returns with the problems they expected or with new surprises. They care whether fault reports are understandable, whether repairs can be done without extraordinary intervention, and whether the next sortie feels routine or risky. An unmanned boat does not earn trust because it once completed a route. It earns trust when the people supporting it stop treating each mission like an exception. Launch and recovery add another layer of reality. A vessel may be able to operate once it is already in the water and already configured, but fleets do not live inside that perfect frame. They have to move equipment, prepare launches, recover craft that may return with degraded systems, and do all of it in the clutter of real naval schedules. Launch and recovery shape how quickly a vessel can be used, where it can be used from, and how much infrastructure has to gather around it. If those steps are cumbersome, weather-sensitive, manpower-heavy, or highly specialized, then the promised advantage of an unmanned platform begins to shrink under the weight of its own support needs. The same is true for daily command relationships. A successful demonstration can tolerate a high ratio of expert attention to one vessel. It can rely on a carefully prepared team, a defined route, extra technicians, and the institutional patience that surrounds an experiment. A durable fleet routine is the opposite. A fleet routine means the vessel fits into ordinary planning cycles, ordinary support windows, ordinary communications discipline, and ordinary human bandwidth. It means operators do not need to reinvent the process each time. That is the real difference between a demo and a habit. A demo proves a possibility. A habit proves the Navy can absorb that possibility without distorting everything around it. This helps explain the role of Unmanned Surface Vessel Squadron 1. According to the Navy's own description, USVRON-1 exists to lead the introduction and deployment of medium unmanned surface vessels, along with the critical sensors, networks, and payloads that support fleet commanders and enhance lethality. That mission is revealing. It does not describe a narrow contest over hull shape or a single test article. It describes integration. The squadron's burden is to make these systems meaningful inside the fleet, to connect the vessel itself with the sensors it carries, the networks it relies on, and the payloads that make it worth sending to sea in the first place. Integration is where many appealing unmanned concepts encounter their real friction. A medium unmanned vessel is not useful because it floats autonomously in a broad sense. It becomes useful when its sensor outputs fit decision-making, when its mission package works within naval command structures, when its network connections hold up enough to sustain confidence, and when the vessel can be maintained and reassigned without consuming the attention of every specialist nearby. That is a much harder accomplishment than a single voyage or a publicized test. It requires the boat to become legible to the fleet, not merely impressive to observers. The Navy's wider search for lower-cost unmanned mass makes these questions even sharper. Reporting around smaller unmanned craft and broader unmanned experimentation has pointed to a desire for procurement speed and for numbers, not just one exquisite platform. That context matters because it raises the standard for every medium unmanned vessel. If the strategic point is to create useful mass, then each unit cannot behave like a rare laboratory instrument. It has to be affordable enough, supportable enough, and dependable enough that the force can imagine several of them working at once, across multiple commands, without each one demanding a boutique ecosystem. Once scale enters the picture, logistics stops being background and becomes destiny. Fueling, repairs, spare parts, software updates, peer space, support teams. transport between operating areas, and the management of mission modules all become central. A platform can look compelling in a test fleet and still disappoint once the logistics train is asked to support it repeatedly. Every promised benefit has to survive that translation. If endurance is real, logistics pressure eases. If payload swaps are genuinely efficient, operational tempo improves. If communications are durable, commanders can leave the vessel in the field longer. If maintenance is heavy, the entire picture bends in the opposite direction. Even something as simple as routine usefulness is more demanding than it sounds. Daily fleet usefulness means commanders know why the vessel is on today's plan. It means the sensors it carries answer a real question. It means the range and speed it offers fit a current need. It means the network can absorb what it sends. It means recovery will not derail tomorrow's schedule. It means maintenance after the mission will not strand the platform for a week. This is the standard manned ships live under without fanfare. For unmanned vessels, it is the threshold between experimental relevance and operational membership. That is why operators care so intensely about maintenance, communications, launch and recovery, payload swaps, and trust. These are not peripheral engineering details. They are the entire difference between a vessel that expands naval options and one that merely expands naval complexity. A platform that looks inexpensive at acquisition can become expensive in handling. A vessel that looks flexible in design can become awkward in turnaround. A boat that seems bold in concept can quietly become brittle in routine use. Sailors tend to recognize this faster than institutions do, because they experience every elegant idea as a practical burden unless it proves otherwise. The experimental record already shows meaningful progress. The Navy has real prototype vessels. It has used them as distributed sensor platforms. It has integrated them with exercises. It has assigned a squadron with the explicit mission of bringing medium unmanned vessels, sensors, networks, and payloads into useful alignment for fleet commanders. Reporting has also described rough requirement markers, including about 2,500 nautical miles of endurance, around 25 knots of speed, operation in sea state 4, payload capacity up to 25 metric tons, space for at least two 40-foot containers, and an operational availability target tied to the later part of this decade. But reporting of that kind does not erase the core uncertainty. It only defines the hill the Navy still has to climb. And that hill is operational, not rhetorical. It is the climb from one successful event to a pattern that survives weather, distance, wear, limited bandwidth, shifting payloads, and the skepticism that any fleet naturally directs at a new system until that system earns its keep. The vessel has to leave the pier, do useful work, stay connected enough to matter, return without drama, be maintained without theater, take on the next mission package without prolonged friction, and head back out again. Then it has to do that repeatedly, under enough variation that the Navy can stop calling the result encouraging and start calling it dependable. That is what these boats must actually do. They must be more than promising unmanned hulls. They must become working naval instruments whose endurance, payload handling, autonomy, control, maintenance profile, sea state performance, and logistics burden all hold together as one believable system. Until that happens, the debate remains unfinished. The prototypes may be real, the missions may be plausible, and the strategic demand for unmanned mass may be growing, but the final argument will be decided by routine. And routine at sea is where every abstract advantage is tested against distance, weather, fatigue, friction, and the relentless question of whether the fleet is truly better off with the vessel there. Prototypes may be real, the missions may be plausible, and the strategic demand for unmanned mass may be growing, but the final argument will be decided by routine. And routine at sea is where every abstract advantage is tested against distance, weather, fatigue, friction, and the relentless question of whether the fleet is truly better off with the vessel there. That question becomes sharper in the Pacific, because the Pacific is not just a battlefield in waiting. It is a geometry problem on an unforgiving scale. The distances between likely operating areas are vast. The time needed to move from one point to another is measured in long transits rather than quick dashes, and the ocean itself works against concentration. A force can be powerful and still be thinly spread. It can be modern and still arrive late. In that environment, the core problem is not simply how to win a clash once contact is made. It is how to sense, persist, and remain present across enormous spaces before, during, and after any decisive action. That is why distance, persistence, and wide area sensing sit at the center of the Pacific problem. A navy may own exquisite ships with formidable weapons and advanced radars, but even the most capable surface combatant can only be in one place at one time. The ocean does not care how expensive the hull is. If the ship is hundreds or thousands of miles from the place where a contact emerges, where a decoy should be laid, where a lane must be watched, or where a pattern of life needs to be maintained day after day, its sophistication cannot erase geography. Presence still has to be generated, surveillance still has to be sustained, uncertainty still has to be managed over wide water. In a more compact theater, a commander might accept gaps and rely on rapid concentration. In the Pacific, those gaps become strategic features. They are large enough to hide movement, to absorb delay, and to create repeated moments when the force simply does not know enough, soon enough. That is where unmanned systems begin to matter less as futuristic curiosities and more as practical tools. Not because they replace the fleet, and not because autonomy dissolves risk, but because they offer a way to thicken the network. They can sit farther forward, stay out longer, cover more mundane tasks, and hold contact or at least hold awareness in places where sending a major warship would be inefficient, unaffordable, or tactically unwise. The logic is not mysterious. If a theater demands many eyes, many emitters, many decoys, many relay points, and many opportunities to observe without exposing a capital asset, then a force built around a small number of expensive ships will feel strain almost immediately. Those ships still matter. They carry command authority, high-end weapons, and political weight. They are the instruments of deterrence and, if necessary, destruction. But they are too valuable to spend carelessly on every sensing problem. They cannot be the answer to every search task, every deception task, every watch, every communications bridge, and every persistent screen. A fleet that asks them to do all of that is effectively burning premium capacity on chores produced by scale. That is where the Navy's own emerging logic becomes revealing. In the May 2026 shipbuilding plan, the official language points toward a larger, more balanced fleet, built around a high-low mix, advanced combatants at the top end, cost-effective frigates in the middle, and unmanned systems as part of the wider architecture. The significance of that formulation is not rhetorical. It reflects an admission that one layer cannot carry the whole burden. High-end ships remain essential, but a force designed only around the most complex and expensive platforms becomes brittle when asked to cover too much ocean for too long. Balance, in this context, is not a slogan. It is an operational answer to theater scale. The high-low mix also acknowledges something older than the current unmanned debate. Navies have long understood that not every mission deserves the same platform. Some tasks demand survivability and concentrated combat power. Others demand endurance, numbers, and acceptable risk. In the Pacific, the burden of those lower-end but constant demands grows heavier. A frigate can do things a destroyer should not have to do. An unmanned vessel can do things a frigate should not have to do. Once the force begins to sort missions honestly, the appeal of robotic and autonomous systems stops sounding like a fashionable theory and starts looking like simple arithmetic. Too many jobs exist at too many distances for only a few precious hulls to carry them all. That arithmetic becomes even more compelling when the mission is not a dramatic strike, but the slow production of awareness. Wide-area sensing is rarely cinematic. It is repetitive, patient work. It means watching routes, revisiting contacts, testing whether an anomaly is meaningful, and keeping a picture alive through time rather than generating a single snapshot. In a Pacific contingency, that picture would matter before the first shot and after it. It would shape logistics, warning, deception, queuing, escort decisions, and the use of scarce manned platforms. Unmanned vessels do not have to be magical to contribute here. They only have to be numerous enough, affordable enough, and networked well enough to keep more parts of the map from going dark. This is why the future fleet framing described in defense reporting matters. In that reporting, Admiral Daryl Cottle's argument is that a one-size-fits-all fleet design will not work, and that the force needs hedge capacity, risk-worthy mass, and robotic autonomous systems. Even with careful attribution, the meaning is clear. Hedge capacity is what a theater like the Pacific consumes. It is the margin that allows a force to absorb breakdowns, diversions, weather, and the stubborn surprise of operations. Risk-worthy mass is what lets commanders place assets where loss or compromise would be painful but not catastrophic. Robotic systems fit that logic because they can extend presence without forcing every tactical question to be answered by a ship whose absence would be strategically felt elsewhere. The Pacific also magnifies the value of deception, and deception too is a matter of mass. A fleet that can distribute signatures, create ambiguity, complicate targeting, and force an adversary to spend time and attention sorting the real from the false gains a form of depth that does not depend entirely on armor or missile cells. But deception only works if there are enough pieces in play. A handful of unmanned vessels may demonstrate concepts. They do not saturate uncertainty. To make an enemy's search problem harder, to create a screen that is not easily read, or to build pathways for misleading emissions and false patterns, a force needs numbers. It needs enough platforms that the network can lose some, reroute some, and still continue to confuse. That is one reason reporting about larger planned unmanned inventories has attracted attention. Defense reporting has said that thousands of smaller unmanned surface vessels and more than 30 medium unmanned surface vessels by 2030 have been discussed as part of the Navy's broader push toward unmanned capacity in the Indo-Pacific. Reporting is not a delivered fleet, and discussion is not the same thing as funded, fielded routine. But the scale of those figures is revealing in itself. It suggests that serious planners understand the problem cannot be solved by token quantities. If the theater challenge is truly about distance, persistence, and sensing its scale, then the answer, if it exists, will almost certainly involve a lot more holes than traditional force structure habits would once have accepted. Still, numbers alone are not the point. What matters is how those numbers change the behavior of the fleet. A larger population of smaller craft can become the outer skin of a maritime network, the first layer that detects, relays, probes, and distracts. Medium unmanned vessels can add endurance, payload, and operational reach that tiny craft cannot match. Frigates and other lower-cost manned ships can take on missions that would otherwise consume premier combatants. High-end ships can then do what only they can do: command the fight, survive inside danger, and deliver concentrated effect. The value of unmanned mass, then, is not that it wins by itself. It is that it reorganizes who does what, where, and at what cost. That reorganization matters especially because the Pacific punishes overcommitment. If a destroyer is tied to a persistent watch task for too long, it is not merely busy. It is absent from every other problem. If an amphibious ship or logistics node must move through waters where the picture is thin, then uncertainty expands around it. If communications are stretched across islands, sea lanes, and contested electromagnetic conditions, every additional relay point and every extra sensor becomes more than a convenience. A distributed force only works if it can remain distributed without becoming blind. Unmanned systems, if they are reliable enough and integrated well enough, offer a way to keep the distributed force connected to itself. That word, integrated, is where exercises begin to matter. Coalition warfare in the Pacific is not an accessory to American strategy. It is central to how the burden of presence, surveillance, and deterrence is actually carried. An official announcement for RIMPAC 2026 described a force of 31 nations, 40 surface ships, 5 submarines, and more than 140 aircraft, with extensive interoperability activity in missile events, anti-submarine warfare, and mine warfare. Those numbers matter because they show scale. But the more important point is what such an exercise trains: the habit of connecting different fleets, different systems, and different operating cultures into something that can function under pressure. For distributed maritime networks, interoperability is not a ceremonial ideal. It is the difference between a map that is shared and a map that fragments. If unmanned vessels are to have real military value in the Pacific, they cannot become isolated gadgets belonging to isolated services. Their feeds, queues, and control relationships have to fit into coalition patterns. Their data has to be meaningful to partners. Their presence has to reinforce a common picture rather than flood commanders with disconnected signals. Exercises like RIMPAC matter precisely because they expose this reality in peacetime. They show whether a network remains coherent when many flags, many platforms, and many mission sets are involved. In a theater as large as the Pacific, no single navy can assume perfect coverage or perfect self-sufficiency. That coalition dimension also sharpens the case against relying on only a few exquisite ships. High-end combatants remain indispensable national assets, but they are not a complete language for alliance operations. A broad network can be more adaptable than a narrow one because it offers more ways for allies and partners to plug in, contribute, and sustain local awareness. Some partners may provide ships, some aircraft, some undersea capabilities, some sensors, some basing access, some relay nodes, some mine warfare expertise. A force structured around many interoperable layers is better suited to that world than a force that assumes a handful of elite vessels can solve every problem if only they are positioned cleverly enough. The Pacific is too large and coalition warfare is too complex for clever positioning alone to close all the gaps. And yet none of this should be romanticized. The Pacific does not automatically reward the side with more unmanned hulls. Routine still rules. Salt water corrodes. Communications fail. Maintenance windows appear at the wrong moment. Weather reshapes plans. Software behaves differently after weeks underway than it did in controlled tests. The network that looked elegant on a briefing slide becomes noisy and partial in the real world. That is why official language about speed to capability, iterative development, modular open systems, and stable requirements matter so much in the 2026 shipbuilding plan. The point is not only to buy things faster, it is to learn faster, repair faster, adapt faster, and avoid freezing a still maturing concept into rigid procurement habits. In that sense, the Pacific scale problem is not merely about tactics. It is about whether the Navy can turn unmanned mass into dependable routine before crisis compresses the timeline. A few successful demonstrations do not answer that. Neither do a few elegant prototypes. What answers it is the slow accumulation of systems that can endure, connect, and be trusted enough to shoulder real workload over real distance. The high-low mix is an attempt to describe that future structure. Reporting about larger unmanned inventories suggests the service knows the scale of the requirement. Exercises like RIMPAC show the coalition environment in which the network would have to function. Together, they point in the same direction. The Pacific rewards fleets that can spread out without going blind, deceive without exhausting themselves, and persist without wasting their most valuable ships on every low-end demand. That is why unmanned mass matters so much here. Not as a fashionable replacement for capital ships, and not as a shortcut around the hard work of naval power, but as a way to make naval power usable across the world's largest ocean. A small number of expensive ships can deliver force. They cannot alone provide every screen, every lure, every watch station, every relay, and every patient sensing function that this theater imposes. The Pacific makes that limitation impossible to ignore. It stretches fleets until doctrine becomes procurement, and procurement becomes calendar. Once the need for distributed mass is accepted, the next question is no longer whether more hulls would be useful. The next question is whether they can actually be built, integrated, and fielded in time. That is where the argument runs into steel, engines, labor, and time. It is one thing to say the Pacific requires more distributed mass. It is another to turn that conclusion into hulls that can survive real water, carry useful payloads, integrate with naval systems, and appear on a calendar that war planners can actually use. By late May 2026, the Navy had moved that question out of the abstract and into a compressed competition, selecting 7 companies for medium unmanned surface vessel at sea demonstrations: Sea Machines, Leidos, Saronic Technologies, Galliano Marine Services, Pacmar Technologies, Burden, and Huntington Ingalls Industries. The point was not to crown a paper winner after years of conceptual debate. The point was to push prototypes into the water quickly, begin testing the next month, and complete that testing by October 2026. That deadline matters because it reveals how little patience is left in the system. In a slower era, an unmanned vessel effort might have wandered through years of refinement before facing a hard operational clock. Here, the calendar is part of the strategy. The Navy's own shipbuilding plan in May 2026 stressed speed to capability, iterative development cycles, modular open systems, stable requirements, and industrial base revitalization. Those phrases are not bureaucratic decoration. They are an admission that a force designed for a widening maritime theater cannot wait for perfect maturity. Capability has to arrive in useful increments, and it has to arrive while there is still time to shape the balance of the decade. That is also why the prototype phase was structured as a marketplace rather than a single, traditional prime-led procession. The Navy did not place its entire bet on one builder, one architecture, or one industrial lane. It selected a spread of firms with different backgrounds, different assumptions, and different ways of approaching autonomy, hull construction, integration, and scale. Each successful entry could receive $15 million and become eligible for follow-on production. Eligibility is not the same thing as a guaranteed production run, and that distinction is important. The demonstrations create options. They do not erase the hard work that begins after a prototype proves it can move, endure, and carry what it is supposed to carry. The marketplace logic reflects a larger shift in naval thinking. Reporting around the Navy's broader unmanned push has described a search for lower-cost unmanned mass and procurement speed, not simply the pursuit of one exquisite unmanned hull. That difference cuts to the heart of the industrial problem. If the service is trying to build a force that can spread risk, extend sensing, and create hedge capacity across long distances, then it cannot rely only on a handful of complex, slow, and expensive build paths. It needs enough variety in the industrial base to support experimentation, substitution, and parallel production. It needs ways to absorb failure in one lane without freezing the whole effort. That is where smaller and non-traditional yards begin to matter. In a conventional program, major shipyards dominate because they have the infrastructure, the certification history, and the political weight to carry long naval construction lines. But a marketplace model built around unmanned systems is trying to buy something different from the old template. It is trying to buy speed, adaptation, and the ability to move from concept to useful demonstration without every idea first passing through the slowest and most capital-intensive channel. Smaller builders and firms outside the classic hierarchy can widen the field, introduce competition at a lower price point, and create additional places where production knowledge can accumulate. They are not a replacement for major yards in every category, but they matter because they add throughput, optionality, and pressure against monopoly pacing. That does not mean the industrial bottleneck is solved. It means the Navy is trying to attack the bottleneck from more angles. The May 2026 shipbuilding plan linked unmanned systems to industrial base revitalization and to expansion backed by private capital. That language signals a recognition that the government cannot simply declare speed into existence. Yards need facilities, workers, suppliers, and confidence that their investment will not collapse when requirements shift or budget politics change. Modular open systems are part of that answer because they promise more flexibility in how hulls are equipped and updated. But modularity only helps if the modules exist, if interfaces are disciplined, and if the supply chain can deliver them in useful quantities. Requirements discipline is therefore not a side issue. It is one of the central industrial variables. Reporting on prototype expectations has described a vessel with roughly 2,500 nautical miles of range, a speed of 25 knots, operation in sea state 4, payload capacity up to 25 metric tons, and space for at least two 40-foot containers, alongside an operational availability goal in fiscal year 2027. Even treated carefully as reported requirements, rather than final formal specifications, those figures sketch the Navy's dilemma. The vessel has to be large and capable enough to be relevant in the Pacific, but not so exquisite that it reproduces the very procurement trap unmanned systems are supposed to escape. Every one of those numbers pushes against the others. Range asks for endurance. Speed asks for power. Payload asks for volume, structure, and stability. Operation in tougher water asks for a hull that can keep functioning when conditions become real rather than demonstrative. Containerized flexibility sounds elegant, but containers still need power, interfaces, control logic, and physical integration that work at sea rather than in a concept image. The closer those requirements drift toward a miniature combatant, the more the industrial advantages of a faster, broader marketplace begin to narrow. The closer they drift toward simplicity, the greater the risk that the resulting platform cannot carry enough useful function to justify the effort. Stable requirements matter because this balance can break under constant revision. That is why the shipbuilding plan's emphasis on iterative development cycles is so important. Iteration is not just a software habit imported into maritime language. In this context, it is a way of protecting the schedule from the perfection reflex. A first useful vessel does not need to embody every future payload, every edge case, and every command ambition at once. If the architecture is modular and open enough, functions can be added, swapped, or refined across cycles. That approach offers a plausible route around some traditional naval delays. Instead of waiting for a finished and frozen design before moving, the service can learn from real hulls under real stress and then adjust. But iteration also has a darker side if it becomes an excuse for vagueness. Industry can build faster when interfaces are clear, when thresholds are credible, and when a builder knows what counts as success. Industry slows down when it suspects that a program will keep changing its mind after each round of enthusiasm. The same is true for capital. Private investment may help expand capacity, but investors are not funding abstract appetite. They are funding a belief that the demand signal will survive contact with budgets, politics, test results, and doctrinal argument. A prototype market can attract entrants. A stable production environment is what keeps them there. That is why fast prototypes do not automatically equal scalable production. A company can build a compelling demonstrator with concentrated talent, commercial shortcuts, and hand-built integration that would be difficult to repeat across larger numbers. A prototype can succeed partly because a small expert team solved problems in ways that do not translate cleanly to a broader workforce or a stretched supplier base. A vessel can perform in testing, while depending on components with fragile availability, costly support burdens, or limited naval certification pathways. Demonstration speed proves initiative. It does not by itself prove manufacturing depth. The October 2026 testing deadline therefore has to be read with discipline. It is a meaningful forcing function, but it is still only a gate in the process. By that point, the Navy expects at-sea demonstrations to be complete. That can clarify which concepts survive contact with the water and which do not. It can expose whether autonomy behaves well enough in operationally relevant conditions. It can show whether payload promises translate into practical arrangement and whether hull forms hold up against the sea states and endurance being asked of them. What it cannot do in a single season is guarantee that the winners are ready for frictionless, funded, large-scale production. The reported fiscal year 2027 availability goal has to be understood in that same careful way. It shows ambition, and it shows how compressed the Navy wants this timeline to be. But it remains reporting on a goal, not proof that an operational fleet presence is already locked. Even if the testing phase produces clear standouts, availability in the following fiscal year depends on more than technical promise. It depends on decisions about funding, integration, support, training, contracting, and the degree to which follow-on production actually proceeds. The distance between an eligible prototype and an operationally available capability can look short on a slide and much longer in a shipyard. This is where the industrial base becomes strategic rather than administrative. If the Navy's wider unmanned discussions really do include, as reported, thousands of smaller unmanned surface vessels and more than 30 medium unmanned surface vessels by 2030, then the burden does not fall on a single competition alone. It falls on an ecosystem that has to build different kinds of craft at different price points for different roles without collapsing into delay or fragmentation. That is why the shipbuilding plan pairs fleet expansion with revitalization. Revitalization is not rhetoric about patriotic industry. It is recognition that doctrine now depends on whether the nation can generate maritime capacity faster than threats can mature, and the Navy's own future fleet framing points in the same direction. Reporting on Admiral Daryl Caudle's view of the coming force has emphasized that a one-size-fits-all design will not work, and that the fleet needs hedge capacity, risk-worthy mass, and robotic autonomous systems. That language rejects the fantasy that one perfect unmanned vessel can solve the entire distribution problem. It suggests a layered future in which some systems are robust and reusable, some are numerous and relatively affordable, and all of them exist to complicate an enemy's search and targeting problem. Industrially, that argues for diversity in builders and production methods. Strategically, it argues against waiting for a single immaculate answer. Still, diversity brings its own management burden. A broader vendor field can increase resilience, but it can also create integration headaches if each entrant arrives with incompatible assumptions about control systems, payload interfaces, maintenance practices, or data handling. That is where modular open systems become more than a procurement slogan. They are supposed to give the Navy a common language across varied platforms, allowing payloads and software paths to move with less reinvention from one hull to another. If that works, the service can preserve competition while still building a coherent force. If it fails, the result could be a scattered flotilla of isolated experiments that are quick to build and slow to operationalize. That tension helps explain why the October clock is so unforgiving. The Navy is not merely testing whether these vessels can sail, it is testing whether speed, modularity, and disciplined requirements can coexist inside a real acquisition pathway. The service is trying to prove that a quicker market entry model can still yield platforms with enough endurance, enough payload utility, and enough interoperability to matter in the Pacific. It is also testing whether industrial revitalization can be stimulated through actual demand rather than policy aspiration alone. The demonstrations are therefore technical events, acquisition events, and industrial signals at the same time, seen that way. The 7-company field is less a contest for a single trophy than a stress test of the Navy's entire theory of acceleration. Can a service accustomed to long cycles move in shorter loops without losing coherence? Can smaller and non-traditional yards be brought into naval work in a way that expands capacity without degrading standards? Can modularity preserve commonality while leaving room for competition? Can reported goals for fiscal year 2027 availability survive the frictions that usually appear after prototype enthusiasm meets production reality? Those are the real questions buried inside the program's outward momentum. None of this argues for pessimism as a posture. The Navy has, in fact, moved the issue forward by forcing real demonstrations on a visible clock and by framing the larger shipbuilding effort around speed to capability instead of deferring everything to a distant finished state. That matters. It shows the institution understands that procurement itself has become part of deterrence. In a theater measured by distance and exposure, late capability is not simply delayed capability. It can become irrelevant capability. The push toward iterative cycles. Modular open systems and a broader industrial field is an attempt to keep that from happening. But realism matters more than optimism. The existence of prototypes does not prove the industrial base is healthy. Eligibility for follow-on production does not mean every production path is funded, settled, and secure. A hard testing deadline does not guarantee a smooth transition into service. What it does provide is a clearer view of whether the Navy can convert unmanned ambition into repeatable output before the strategic calendar closes further. The Pacific does not reward elegant concepts that arrive late. It rewards systems that can be built in numbers, integrated under pressure, and kept useful as conditions change. So the October 2026 deadline stands as more than a program milestone. It is a measure of whether naval adaptation can move at something closer to the speed of the problem. If the demonstrations succeed, the Navy will still face the harder work of scaling production, stabilizing follow-on demand, and stitching varied unmanned platforms into a force that commanders can trust. If they stumble, the consequences will reach beyond one vessel class because the underlying requirement remains. Distributed maritime mass is still needed. The Pacific still imposes the same distances, and any answer worthy of the theater will have to travel from prototype promise into a larger web of ships, sensors, operators, and partners that can fight as one. The first real test of this idea does not appear in a glossy concept drawing or lab demonstration. It appears when unmanned systems are pushed into the crowded multinational reality of modern naval operations, where many fleets, many command cultures, and many technical systems have to function together under pressure. That is why the most revealing frame is not a single platform in isolation. It is the coalition environment. The question is no longer whether an unmanned vessel can move, sense, or transmit on its own. The question is whether it can become part of a wider maritime battle network, one that stretches across allied ships, aircraft, operators, and commands without collapsing into confusion or fragility. RIMPAC 2026 offers one of the clearest windows into that future, not because an exercise can prove wartime readiness in every dimension, but because of its scale and the range of interactions it forces into the open. The exercise brought together 31 nations, 40 surface ships, 5 submarines, and more than 140 aircraft. It also included extensive interoperability activity in missile warfare, anti-submarine warfare, and mine warfare. That matters because unmanned systems cannot be judged only by what they do in a narrow lane. They have to fit into the traffic, tempo, and decision burden of a force that is already operating across multiple warfare areas at once. In that setting, a drone boat stops being a novelty. It becomes one moving node among many, and its value depends on whether it helps the larger force see sooner, decide faster, and distribute risk more intelligently. That is the real significance of a fleet exercise on this scale. RIMPAC is not simply a venue for showing new equipment to visiting delegations. It is an argument about integration. In a coalition fight, the decisive problem is rarely the mere existence of a sensor or a hull. It is whether information gathered by one part of the force can be trusted, moved, interpreted, and acted upon by the rest of the force before the moment passes. An unmanned craft that performs beautifully in a controlled demonstration but cannot plug into a wider operational web adds less than its advocates might hope. By contrast, a modest system that can survive the procedural and technical friction of allied operations may matter far more than its appearance suggests. That is why the emerging Navy language around unmanned squadrons is so revealing. The public descriptions are not centered on gadgets. They are centered on systems and conditions. The mission language associated with these units points toward resilient distributed operations, not remote control theater. In the Pacific, where distance punishes every weak link, that distinction is fundamental. If a network depends on perfect connectivity, then it is already living on borrowed time. If it assumes bandwidth will be constrained, interrupted, or denied, then it begins to look more like something shaped by the realities of modern conflict rather than by the convenience of peacetime demonstrations. USVR-17 makes that point with unusual clarity. Its mission is described in terms of delivering formidable unmanned platforms and innovating through resilient distributed systems in bandwidth-limited or denied environments to enhance decision speed and lethality. That phrase is more important than it may first appear. It shifts the emphasis away from the vehicle itself and toward the conditions under which the vehicle must still contribute. A bandwidth-limited or denied environment is not a technical footnote. It is a warning that the future network cannot assume uninterrupted command, constant streaming data, or clean, high-capacity links. It has to function through disruption. It has to preserve enough coherence for commanders to act even when the digital picture is incomplete, delayed, or contested. That requirement changes the meaning of autonomy in a maritime context. It is no longer enough for an unmanned platform to follow a route or carry a payload. It must remain useful when communications are degraded and when the chain between detection and decision is under strain. That is a much harder standard, and it is precisely why the coalition frame matters. In a multinational force, friction is already built into the system even before an adversary interferes. Different procedures, different authorities, different levels of access, and different technical architectures all complicate the flow of information. If unmanned systems are to earn a durable place in such a force, they must reduce that friction, or at least avoid making it worse. Otherwise, they risk becoming another burden on already saturated operators. USVR-1 points to the practical path the Navy believes it needs. Its mission is not described as chasing a single dramatic breakthrough. It is to lead the introduction and deployment of medium unmanned surface vessels, along with the critical sensors, networks, and payloads needed to support fleet commanders and enhance lethality. That wording matters because it presents the medium USV as one component inside a broader operational package. Sensors, networks, and payloads are named alongside the vessel itself, as if to underline the obvious truth that a hull without an effective architecture around it is not a meaningful answer. The squadron's role suggests an effort to move beyond isolated experiments and toward an operational ecosystem in which these systems are introduced as part of a connected whole. That same logic becomes even clearer when the lens shifts north into the Allied setting represented by Norway's Arctic Sentry 2026. There, unmanned surface and undersea systems appeared in a high north context shaped by mine countermeasures, maritime domain awareness, and the protection of undersea infrastructure. The setting itself is instructive. This is not a simple open ocean range problem. It is a theater of cold water, difficult conditions, and layered strategic importance, where awareness can be partial, distances can distort response times, and critical infrastructure under the sea carries consequences that extend far beyond naval maneuver alone. In that environment, unmanned systems are not framed as futuristic extras. They are presented as tools within a broader Allied effort to watch, protect, and clear. The high north context also reveals how quickly the unmanned discussion expands beyond strike imagery. Public debate often gravitates toward the most dramatic possibility, a remotely directed vessel racing toward a target. But the Allied operational picture is broader and, in many ways, more demanding. Mine countermeasures require patience, precision, and repeatable coverage. Maritime domain awareness requires persistent collection and the ability to maintain a useful picture over space and time. Protection of undersea infrastructure introduces another layer of sensitivity because the object is not only to detect danger, but to understand ambiguous activity before a crisis hardens. In these missions, unmanned systems serve less as symbols of disruption than as instruments of endurance. They extend the reach of Allied eyes and presence into places where constant manned coverage may be difficult to sustain. Taken together, RIMPAC, Arctic Sentry, USVRON-7, and USVRON-1 tell a more disciplined story than the marketing version often heard around new defense technology. They do not suggest that exercises have solved every problem of doctrine, sustainment, trust, or wartime adaptation. They do not prove the coalition navies have already mastered unmanned warfare across all conditions. What they do suggest is that serious institutions are trying to place these systems inside the real geometry of alliance operations. The emphasis is on interoperability activities, resilient distributed systems, support to fleet commanders, and the integration of vessels with sensors, networks, and payloads. That is a much more useful signal than any isolated claim of breakthrough performance. It also points toward a deeper change in command culture. A coalition battle network built around both manned and unmanned systems asks commanders to think less in terms of individual ships and more in terms of layered effects. One vessel may sense, another may relay, another may interpret, another may act. The value of the whole lies in how well these functions remain connected, or at least mutually legible, when the environment becomes confused and contested. In that world, the unmanned platform is not the protagonist. It is one contributor to a distributed architecture whose strength depends on how well its parts can still cooperate when visibility narrows and communications begin to fray. For the Pacific, that has obvious implications. The theater's distances reward any force that can widen its sensing and extend its presence without exhausting crews or concentrating too much risk in too few holes. But those same distances also magnify every weakness in command and control. A force spread across a vast maritime space cannot afford brittle assumptions about connectivity or a flood of data that operators cannot meaningfully absorb. That is why the language of decision speed matters as much as the language of lethality. A network that generates more confusion than clarity will not compensate for distance. It will amplify the problem. The aim, then, is not to build a larger pile of unmanned objects. It is to build a coalition web in which those objects make the wider fleet more coherent under strain. The Allied dimension is especially important because no major maritime contest is likely to remain a single-nation technical exercise. Partners bring geography, presence, local knowledge, infrastructure access, and political weight. They also bring complexity. If unmanned systems are meant to strengthen coalition deterrence and warfighting, they must be legible across that human and institutional landscape. They must support common tasks, from maritime awareness to mine warfare to infrastructure protection, without assuming perfect sameness among the forces using them. The significance of Norway's high north context and RIMPAC's vast multinational setting is that both expose unmanned systems to exactly this problem. They force the technology to answer not only whether it works, but whether it works with others. That may be the clearest sign that the story has moved beyond gadget fascination. The public mission language now places unmanned systems inside a framework of distributed resilience, allied interoperability, and fleet support. The medium USV is not introduced as a lone revolution. It arrives with sensors, networks, and payloads. The squadron responsible for one part of this future is already speaking in terms of bandwidth-limited or denied environments, which means the institution knows the network will be attacked where it is most vulnerable. In the high north, Allied unmanned operations are tied to practical missions like mine countermeasures, maritime awareness, and safeguarding undersea infrastructure. At RIMPAC, the sheer scale of participating forces makes clear that any enduring contribution from unmanned systems will be measured by their place inside a coalition combat system, not by novelty alone. And that leads to the larger strategic question, waiting just beyond these exercises and squadron mission statements. If unmanned systems are no longer a side project, and if they are increasingly being woven into allied networks rather than treated as isolated experiments, then the shape of the future fleet itself begins to change. The issue is no longer whether a navy adds a few unmanned vessels to its order of battle. The issue is what kind of fleet emerges when sensing, presence, risk, and striking power are distributed across a web of manned ships, unmanned platforms, networks, and partners. The answer will determine whether this shift produces a more adaptive maritime force or merely a more complicated one. What matters now is that the Navy appears to be moving out of the long preface and into a harder phase of choice. Years of prototypes, exercises, and concept language have built the case that medium unmanned surface vessels can do more than drift through PowerPoint. The May 29, 2023 announcement made that shift visible. 7 companies were selected for at-sea demonstrations, with testing set to begin the following month and continue through October. Successful entries can receive $15 million and become eligible for follow-on production. That does not mean the argument is over. It means the argument is changing. The question is no longer whether unmanned surface vessels are interesting. It is whether specific designs built by specific firms can survive the sea, fit the fleet, and justify procurement. That distinction matters because the modern American fleet has spent years living in a tense space between ambition and arithmetic. The Navy's own shipbuilding plan describes a larger, more balanced force built around a high-low mix, advanced combatants at the top end, more cost-effective frigates in the middle, and unmanned systems filling roles that do not require the full burden of a major warship. That language is not a revolution against the manned fleet. It is a recognition that exquisite ships alone cannot solve every problem of presence, sensing, scouting, persistence, and distributed risk. If a future force is meant to be larger, more adaptive, and fast enough to matter, then it likely cannot be made only of the most expensive hulls in the inventory. In that sense, the medium unmanned surface vessel is less a replacement than a pressure test. It asks whether the fleet of the future will be built as a hierarchy of platforms or as a network of roles. The prototypes that came before, including Sea Hunter and Seahawk, already showed one part of that argument. In Navy experimentation, they served as autonomous research vessels and as distributed sensor platforms supporting maritime domain awareness and anti-submarine warfare, and they integrated with fleet exercises. That is important, but it is still only one layer of the story. A research vessel can prove that a thing is possible. A fleet platform has to prove that it is repeatable, supportable, and worth relying on when commanders begin to shape actual operations around its presence. That is why the closing measure here cannot be the elegance of the concept. The concept has always been elegant. A vessel that does not carry a crew can linger, absorb risk differently, and extend the sensing edge of a force without consuming the same personnel burden as a manned ship. It can present an adversary with more contacts, more uncertainty, and more dilemmas. It can help distribute capability across a wider pattern instead of concentrating too much value into a smaller number of visible symbols. But navies do not procure concepts. They procure things that start, sail, connect, endure, and come back ready to sail again. The reporting around the requirement hints at how demanding that threshold may be. Defense reporting has described prototype targets that include roughly 2,500 nautical miles of range, speeds around 25 knots, operation in sea state 4, and payload capacity up to 25 metric tons, with space for at least two 40-foot containers. Reporting has also tied the broader effort to an operational availability goal in fiscal year 2027, even stated carefully, as reported requirements rather than settled final specifications. The outline is revealing. This is not a toy program built to impress on calm water in perfect conditions. It is an attempt to define an unmanned vessel that can move with enough pace, carry meaningful modular payloads, and function in conditions that begin to resemble real fleet work rather than a sheltered demonstration. That is the promise. The risk lies in everything that sits between a promising prototype and a reliable force element. Sea performance is one threshold. Integration is another. Maintenance may prove the hardest of all. An unmanned vessel that cannot be repaired, updated, sustained, and retasked without unusual friction will not create affordable mass. It will create a maintenance puzzle. A vessel that can operate beautifully in isolation but struggles to connect through contested or degraded networks will not strengthen distributed operations. It will complicate them. The Pacific Fleet's own unmanned surface squadron has framed its mission around resilient distributed systems, able to function in bandwidth-limited or denied environments, enhancing decision speed and lethality. That phrase is important because it locates the challenge where it belongs. The problem is not merely building a robot boat. The problem is building part of a combat system that still works when conditions are worst. The industrial question is just as serious. The Navy's plan talks openly about speed to capability, iterative development cycles, stable requirements, modular open systems, industrial base revitalization, and expansion backed by private capital. Those are not decorative phrases. They are admissions of what recent American shipbuilding struggles have made obvious. A fleet concept can fail long before the first operational disappointment if the industrial path behind it is too thin, too unstable, or too slow. Selecting 7 companies for demonstration broadens the field and introduces competition, but competition alone does not guarantee endurance. The marketplace will now test whether companies can move from prototypes and pitch decks to repeatable production, sustained support, and the sort of disciplined follow-through that naval procurement has punished for decades. That is one reason the emerging MUSV field feels larger than a single ship class. It is a referendum on a style of fleet building. Can the Navy buy enough lower-cost, useful, adaptable systems to create real operational mass without locking itself into brittle designs or endless delays? Can it let requirements mature through iteration without losing coherence? Can it keep the architecture open enough that payloads, sensors, and mission packages evolve faster than the whole becomes obsolete? The answer will not come from one demonstration season, but demonstration is where abstraction begins to lose its protective cover. Once vessels are at sea, the ocean becomes the editor. The most sober version of the argument is also the strongest one. The future fleet may not be a choice between the carrier and the drone, between the destroyer and the machine, between inherited prestige and technological disruption. It may instead become a force in which manned power and unmanned mass reinforce one another. Manned ships still bring endurance of command, human judgment, visible deterrent weight, and concentrated capability that no small autonomous vessel can simply replicate. Unmanned systems, by contrast, may bring the numbers, distribution, forward sensing, modular risk, and operational hedge that the manned fleet by itself struggles to generate at acceptable cost. The combination is more plausible than either extreme story because it treats the fleet as an ecosystem rather than a lineup of substitutes. That view also aligns with the broader future fleet framing that has surfaced around senior naval leadership. Reporting on Admiral Caudle's thinking has described a force that rejects a one-size-fits-all design and instead values hedge capacity, risk-worthy mass, and robotic autonomous systems. Even as reporting, that framing captures the strategic logic of the moment. Hedge capacity means a force large and flexible enough to absorb surprise. Risk-worthy mass means units numerous enough and affordable enough to be employed in harder places without treating every deployment as an irreplaceable wager. Robotic systems matter in that picture not because they are futuristic, but because they may be one of the few ways to add numbers, reach, and flexibility without reproducing the full cost structure of the traditional fleet. Still, even that logic has to be held at arm's length until the material evidence catches up. Reporting has described wider Navy discussions involving thousands of smaller unmanned surface vessels and more than 30 medium unmanned surface vessels by 2030 as part of the larger push toward unmanned capacity, especially in the Indo-Pacific. Those numbers are striking, but they remain part of a wider reported conversation, not a finished outcome. The distance between discussion and force structure has always been crowded with delays, trade-offs, revisions, and external shocks. Budget pressure can intrude. Technical trouble can intrude. A concept that works for one mission may disappoint in another. A vessel that looks compelling in a distributed diagram may reveal costly weak points when asked to persist through real operational cycles. And yet, it would be a mistake to retreat from that uncertainty into cynicism. The Navy is not standing still. It has moved from experimentation toward procurement decision, and that movement by itself marks a significant turn. Prototype craft like Sea Hunter and Seahawk helped prove that autonomous vessels could contribute to real naval functions, including sensing and anti-submarine support. The new demonstration phase asks a more consequential question: whether the service can translate those lessons into a field of producible vessels and eventually into a coherent fleet architecture. That is not glamorous work. It is testing schedules, payload handling, maintenance burdens, software updates, industrial contracts, command relationships, and what happens when the weather deteriorates or the network degrades. But navies are made there, in the unbeautiful details that determine whether a theory becomes a habit. So, the strategic meaning of the MUSV marketplace is not simply that unmanned vessels are arriving. It is that the Navy is trying to decide what kind of growth remains possible in an age of cost, delay, and rising maritime demands. If the effort succeeds, success will not look like the disappearance of the manned ship. It will look like a fleet that distributes more of its presence, awareness, and risk across a wider web of manned and unmanned systems, with each doing what it is best suited to do. It will look like commanders having more options, not fewer. It will look like concentration where concentration is needed, and dispersion where dispersion creates advantage. If the effort falls short, the failure will not necessarily come as a dramatic public collapse. It may come quietly, through disappointing sea performance, weak integration, stubborn sustainment problems, unstable requirements, or industrial follow-through that cannot keep pace with ambition. That is what makes this moment important. The competition now underway is not only choosing vendors, it is testing whether a compelling strategic idea can survive contact with procurement reality. For now, the most honest conclusion is a restrained one. The medium unmanned surface vessel has advanced far enough that it can no longer be dismissed as a peripheral experiment, but not far enough to be declared the settled future of naval power. What can be said is narrower and more significant. The fleet that emerges from this period is increasingly likely to be judged not by the grandeur of a few symbols alone, but by the strength of the network they inhabit: manned ships, unmanned platforms, resilient links, industrial depth, and the ability to generate credible combat power across a wider field. Whether that becomes a more adaptive maritime force or merely a more complicated one remains unresolved. The decision is moving closer to the water now, and the sea is where the answer will begin to take shape.